All right, in this video we're going to work through the organization of the nervous system. Right, this is mainly looking at how we essentially detect and respond, just as we talked about in that last video. This idea is that the organization of the nervous system can be broken down into multiple levels. So if you're a mind map person, start making one now, right? Because we're going to start at the top and work our way down. So the idea is we could start with the nervous system. Right, the nervous system can be then broken into two different parts. The first is the central nervous system. Right, the central nervous system is nice and simple, contains two parts. So nervous system, our central nervous system, is going to connect our brain and our spinal cord. Right? So that's one half of the nervous system is the central nervous system. The brain we're going to talk about in a little more detail. We're not going to go into a ton of detail, but we're going to talk about the ones that are going to be important for exercise physiology functions. Right? But this is ultimately going to be able to send and receive information. Right? The spinal cord, on the other hand, this is its main function then is to perform reflex actions. So if you'll remember back to that muscle spindle or the tap your knee reflex, right? It's going to respond to those where we don't actually have to send all the way information all the way back to the brain. Right? The reflex just says goes to the spinal cord and causes an immediate effect. Right? It's also the main area of synapses for afferent and motor neurons leaving. So afferent coming into the central nervous and motor neurons leaving. As we talked about, the motor neurons have their cell bodies actually in the spinal cord and are then able to synapse with skeletal muscle. Right? So those are the two main functions of spinal cords, are reflex actions and contain lots of synapses. Right. The other half of the division, again, if we think about this in a mind map, can be broken into the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system contains kind of two parts: the sensory division, which of course are sensory receptors or afferent neurons, and the motor division, which are both somatic and autonomic. We're going to get into those in more detail, but again, if you have a sheet of paper and are kind of thinking about filling out a mind map, we can start at least with the top. Nervous system broken down into two parts, central and peripheral. The central can then be broken down into two other parts, brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral into sensory and motor. Before we get too far out of the scheme of that, let's stick with our central nervous system. We don't need to spend a ton of time here, but we do need to introduce several different parts. First, let's talk about just the brain. Right? If we can think of the brain, we can look at the three main parts that are going to be important for muscle function or function in general in response to exercise. So those are the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Right, the cerebrum, that's the really large portion shown here in a light blue. This is important for storing learned experiences, aka forming memories. We're able to, as you guys are probably well aware, in exercise physiology, we're able to store learned experiences so that we can then improve performance. Right? We're able to kind of create motor programs. Those are all located in the cerebrum. Receives sensory and organizes complex movements. Again, we can think, as you might imagine, this is really important for being able to perform very complex tasks. So if you can think about it, any sport. So if you think about maybe like a long jumper, right? That their complex movements are sprinting, running, kind of having the eye coordination in order to hit right on the board, right exactly where they want, and then kind of be able to propel themselves forward in a jump. Most of them continue running, and then there's kind of a weird complex movement where they throw their body forward so that they get the most out of the jump. Right? So we can take these complex movements, organize them and form them in memories, and then be able to execute them. Right? The way that we execute them is by sending, of course, signals through motor neurons in order to create that. So one other thing that's located, and I've labeled here in yellow, is the motor cortex. It's a little hard to see, but you should be able to see. It's kind of right in the middle there of the cerebrum. The motor cortex is, of course, then what's going to be sending out the motor signals in order to cause movement. Right? The other thing that we can look at is the cerebellum. As you can see, it's kind of in a pinkish purple color here. The cerebellum is mainly important in motor control. right? So if you've taken Dr. Jin's class on motor learning and motor control, you spend a lot of time in the cerebrum and the cerebellum, right? Of course, those are important for exercise physiology, not actually something we're going to spend a lot of time covering on in this course, but just kind of reintroducing that to you. One of the key things that we are going to talk about, though, is the brainstem. The brainstem is incredibly important for all exercise physiology function, right? The idea that we detect and respond is all going to be in the brainstem. Why? Because it has tons of metabolic functions, right? It controls our cardiorespiratory center, so therefore it's very important for regulating heart rate, blood pressure. It regulates rate of breathing, is going to obviously come into play a lot of that, right? So it also contains a region called the medulla oblongata, which is going to be our primary control region for our respiratory regions as well. We'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. And the last one that we have is the hypothalamus. So what is the hypothalamus? Well, first, let's let you watch a video here from a great movie from my childhood, The Waterboy. I hope I'm not dating myself too much, but this is a great clip, about a minute and a half long, from the movie The Waterboy, where our great friend Colonel Sanders meets the Waterboy, and they have a discussion about what the medulla oblongata does.
Now, is there anyone here that can tell me why most alligators are abnormally aggressive?
I know the answer to this question. Raise your hand.
Anybody? Anyone? Yes or you, sir?
Mama says that alligators are ornery because they got all them teeth but no toothbrush.
Your mama said alligators are ornery because they got all them teeth and no toothbrush. Wow. Anybody else? Yes or you, sir?
Alligators are aggressive because of an enlarged medulla oblongata. It's the sector of the brain which controls aggressive behavior.
That is correct. The medulla oblongata.
But Mama said...
The medulla oblongata is where anger, jealousy, and aggression come from. Now, is there anybody here can tell me where happiness comes from?
No.
Anyone?
Oh.
All right. Let's hear what Mama has to say on the subject.
Mama say that happiness is from magic rays of sunshine that come down when you're feeling blue.
Well, folks, Mama's wrong again.
No, Colonel Sanders, you're wrong. Mama's right.
All wrong. Mama's right. Mama's right. Something wrong with his medulla oblongata.
It's okay to fight back. Coach Klein said I could. Mr. Coach Klein said I could. It's fine.
So of course the water boy was wrong, right? The alligator isn't ornery because he has all those teeth and doesn't have a toothbrush. The funny part about this is that the professor is completely wrong as well. The medulla oblongata does not control anger and aggression. Not at all. And indeed, that is a completely separate, different part of the brain, mainly in the hypothalamus. Right? So what does the medulla oblongata actually do? Again, it's the cardiovascular and respiratory control centers. No anger and aggression, that's in the hypothalamus, which is also shown, we kind of highlighted it in the previous slide where we talked about, it's kind of here in the bright red there. It controls thirst, hunger, and pain. Of course, that thirst is going to be important when we get to that section in the class. So again, medulla oblongata does not cause you to be ornery, does not control anger and aggression as the movie The Waterboy would love to portray. Both of them completely wrong, and indeed it controls thirst, hunger, and pain, whereas the medulla oblongata, the hypothalamus controls thirst, hunger, and pain. The medulla oblongata is our cardiorespiratory control center. So the next part is looking at then getting out of the central nervous system, again, our brain and our spinal cord, and into the other half of our mind map, or our peripheral nervous system, right? Our peripheral nervous system can be broken down into two, depending on who you talk to. The textbook that we use in this class calls it two systems, so I'm going to stick with that for at least the class, but you could make an easy argument that we could break it into three different parts. The first part, of course, is the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is important in maintaining the internal environment and kind of doing things without you having to think about it. Hence the term autonomic, or you can use the other idea of it being called the automatic system. Right? The other part of the peripheral nervous system is the sensory somatic. Again, you can see why that could be split into two different ones, so you could have the sensory or the somatic. Again, our textbook crams them together, so we'll stick with that, and we'll call it the sensory somatic, the idea that they can sense and have motor control, which is the somatic. We're going to look at each of these two in detail. Right? So the autonomic nervous system is responsible for maintaining the internal environment within our body. Right? Really important in maintaining homeostasis. Right? What these do is they innervate effector organs that are not under voluntary control. AKA, again, why I call it not just the autonomic, but the automatic nervous system. Right? So it's going to control all the things that we don't actually have to think about in order to maintain homeostasis. So it regulates our blood pressure and blood vessels. Right? You guys aren't thinking, man, it would be really nice if my blood pressure went down, and then your vessels dilate and you have a reduced blood pressure. And you're not actually regulating your breathing. We can, of course, we can think about breathing, but under normal circumstances, you don't have to constantly remind yourself that you need to take a breath. So again, these are organs not under voluntary control. Right? In our mind map, we can split the autonomic nervous system then into two parts. Again, you can kind of see how this flows very nicely. The two parts are the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. Right? So what is the sympathetic division? This is the fight or flight response. Right? That's the classic idea. Right? The fight or flight response says that the idea is that if you are challenged with something, that you have to have the ability to respond really quickly. So you need to be able to either fight or run. Right? So the idea is that the sympathetic division is almost always going to activate an effector organ. Right? It's going to increase the function of whatever it's working on. Right? So if we have an increase in parasympathetic nervous system on the heart rate, right, our heart rate would go up. And we've experienced that, right? If you get scared, or you can just imagine some situation in which you have a heightened awareness, whereas you get kind of amped up, right? All of our sympathetic nervous system increases. For the most part, one tip that I love to give in this class is if you can kind of think about what the sympathetic nervous system is going to do to the effector organ, then you will likely have a great idea of what is actually happening during exercise. Right? So in general, the sympathetic nervous system is going to regulate a lot of exercise. So if you can recall back from your anatomy and physiology class of how the sympathetic nervous system would affect certain organs, then you're going to have a leg ahead of actually what's happening in exercise. The other division of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic nervous system. Its main function then is to counteract the sympathetic nervous system. So in general, it tends to inhibit or decrease the activity of the effector organ. So our heart rate is going to have, of course, the opposite, such that it will reduce heart rate. I like to give the analogy, the way that I always thought about it in school was to think that the parasympathetic, I would think about this as a paralyzing effect, or decreasing the function of that. That's just the way I kind of thought about it. You can think about it in your own ways, but I think sympathetic, fight or flight, parasympathetic, paralyzing. Right? It's important to note, and of course this makes sense as we think about our feedback loops, is the ability to respond to either of them. So indeed, most organs receive innervation from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Right? So ultimately, the essentially activity of that organ is going to be based on the signals being sent from both, right? So we can think about this as a teeter-totter, right? So homeostasis, they're relatively equal during a fight or flight response, right? The sympathetic's going to go heavier or greater, and it's going to then swing into that side of things, right? The opposite, of course, would be true of the parasympathetic. Again, so it's the idea of that balance, the teeter-totter, or I've been told that that's not a normal term that we use growing up. We call them seesaws, the same idea. So a seesaw is it is ultimately a balance between the two. Right? So again, the activity is regulated by the ratio of the sympathetic to parasympathetic impulses that's ultimately going to control that. If we then jump into the second half of the peripheral nervous system, again, as we continue that mind map down, we then have our somatosensory nervous system, or our sensory somatic, depending on the semantics in the textbooks you read. Right? What's its important part is to coordinate actions and responses to the external environment. Okay. We have our sensory division, which receives signals from the effector organs, so we can get signals from the tendons through things like the Golgi tendon organs. We have joint proprioception. We have, of course, have pain, different things in our skin to be able to send. Our muscles can somewhat respond to this. We have our eyes, our ears, our nose, our sensory, our 5 senses that we can detect. Again, these are all going to use the sensory division. These communicate via afferent nerves. Right? Afferent nerves then are going to take those signals back into the spinal cord and up into the brain. Or they can take them into the spinal cord and a reflex could happen, right? The main function of that spinal cord. And so you can have that reflex which then would then communicate back through an efferent nerve as shown here in the picture. Right? The efferent nerve is, of course, the somatic part of the nervous system, aka the motor division. Right? So sensory and somatic, otherwise known as the motor division. What it's going to do is it's going to initiate contraction of muscles. Right? That's really its primary goal, is to communicate to muscles, whether that's cardiac, smooth, or skeletal muscle. These are our organs that, of course, can have motor movement. Right? So that's how we can kind of break down the nervous system. So again, if we can kind of think about this in a mind map situation, we have our nervous system here that can be broken down into 2 parts, our central and peripheral. If we focus on our central, of course, we can think about, we have our brain and we have our spinal cord. Right? The brain's function is, of course, to send and receive and kind of integrate signals and send commands to effector organs, whereas our central nervous system, its main focus is to have reflex activity that we don't involve the brain in, and also really important for just having synapses for all the afferent and efferent nerves, as you can clearly see here in this picture taking place in the spinal cord. Right? If we then jump to the other side, which is our peripheral nervous system, we can then look at this into our autonomic and our somatosensory. Right? Our autonomic can then be spliced into 2 pieces. It can be both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, whereas the sympathetic is going to increase the activity of an organ, and our parasympathetic is going to decrease the activity of that organ. If we then look on the last one, which is our somatosensory, we have our sensory division and our motor division. Our sensory is going to receive signals from tendons, joints, muscles, et cetera, and then our motor division is going to then carry out those through initiation of contraction of skeletal muscle and then be able to cause some type of motor movement. So that'll wrap up kind of the entire kind of process of looking at the structure and function of the nervous system and how we break it down, going all the way from the idea of a simple nerve all the way down to how they work and communicate. As we'll get into in the next module, we'll start talking about how these actually work to cause movement, how we regulate force, and how these kind of all integrate into a working system that's able to send and receive signals in order to cause muscle contraction, which ultimately is the defining feature of exercise and exercise physiology.